Imagine being a Japanese pilot in 1945, soaring high over your own capital, Tokyo. The streets below are busy with life, unaware of the storm approaching from above. You glance at the sky, scanning for enemy aircraft, confident in your defenses. Suddenly, streaking across the horizon at nearly 444 miles per hour, sleek American fighters appear out of nowhere. These aren't ordinary planes, they're P-51 Mustangs, gleaming under the sun, cutting through the clouds like shadows of death. They carry something unusual under their wings, drop tanks, enabling them to travel hundreds of miles farther than anyone thought possible. In that instant, disbelief sets in. How could enemy planes reach so far into Japanese territory? How could they strike the capital itself, right under the nose of your air defenses, and vanish before you could even react? For the Japanese pilots, this was a moment of sheer shock, a moment that would redefine the very nature of air combat over their homeland. Tokyo, a city that once believed its skies were secure, suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable, and defenseless. This moment was not just about technology or speed. It was about surprise, strategy, and the psychological impact of seeing an enemy appear where they were least expected. It was the dawning realization that the United States, despite the vast distance of the Pacific Ocean, had the means and daring to strike deep into Japan itself. The story of the P-51 Mustang and its drop tanks is one of ingenuity, planning, and the relentless pursuit of air supremacy, a combination that left the Japanese completely unprepared. To truly understand the shock felt by Japanese pilots, we need to first look at what made the Mustangs so special. The P-51 was not just a fighter, it was a revolutionary aircraft designed to dominate the skies. Powered by the incredible Packard-built Merlin engine, it could reach speeds that left most Japanese fighters struggling to keep up. Its long range meant it could escort bombers over Japan and then return safely, a capability previously thought impossible. But the addition of drop tanks took this to an entirely new level. These external fuel tanks could be attached to the wings, dramatically increasing the Mustang's range. Once the fuel was used, the tanks could be jettisoned, leaving the aircraft light and fast. This simple yet brilliant innovation allowed American pilots to launch attacks from hundreds of miles away, far beyond what Japanese defenses anticipated. Before the Mustangs arrived over Tokyo, Japanese radar and early warning systems were designed to detect threats closer to the homeland. They were prepared for short-range attacks, sudden raids, or bombers arriving from nearby islands. But these long-range, high-speed fighters were something entirely different. The Japanese Air Force had trained to counter conventional threats, but the Mustangs challenged every assumption they had made about air combat. Suddenly, their skies were no longer predictable. Enemy planes could appear out of nowhere, strike with precision, and retreat before the defenders had a chance to engage. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots cannot be overstated. Many were highly experienced, having flown missions over China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. They had faced American bombers, fighters, and carrier planes before. But nothing had prepared them for the sight of P-51 Mustangs arriving over Tokyo itself, appearing almost like ghosts from the horizon. The speed of the aircraft made them difficult to target, and the Japanese quickly realized that their anti-aircraft guns were less effective than they had hoped. These were not just planes, they were symbols of technological superiority, a demonstration that Japan's air defenses were no longer enough to guarantee safety. The first encounters were chaotic. Japanese pilots scrambled to intercept the Mustangs, only to find themselves outmatched in speed and maneuverability. The Mustangs could climb, dive, and turn with precision, striking targets on the ground and in the air, then disappearing before a counterattack could be organized. Each engagement left Japanese pilots frustrated, confused, and demoralized. Reports from the time describe how pilots struggled to identify these high-speed attackers, initially thinking they were experimental aircraft or miscalculating the number of planes involved. The realization that these were regular, well-trained American pilots using advanced tactics only added to the shock. But it wasn't just the pilots who were affected. Ground defenses, radar operators, and command centers all faced similar astonishment. Tokyo's air defense strategy relied on layers of radar detection, interceptor aircraft, and anti-aircraft artillery. Yet the Mustangs, with their extended range and high speed, rendered much of this preparation less effective. Japanese planners began to understand that the Americans had not only built superior aircraft, but had also perfected the art of strategic surprise. They had studied the enemy, calculated flight paths, and designed missions that exploited weaknesses in Japan's defenses. Each Mustang that appeared over Tokyo was a reminder that the enemy was capable of reaching any corner of the country, striking where it was least expected. The use of drop tanks was central to this strategy. Without them, the Mustangs could not have reached Tokyo from their forward bases. These tanks allowed fighters to fly beyond their normal operational limits, giving them the ability to escort bombers on long-range missions or strike targets independently. Once the fuel was used, the tanks could be discarded, allowing the plane to fight at peak performance. It was a simple idea, yet its impact was profound. Japanese forces had to confront the reality that their previous understanding of the war in the air was no longer accurate. The very rules of engagement had changed. The shock experienced by Japanese pilots was compounded by the timing and coordination of the missions. American strategists carefully planned Mustang flights to exploit weaknesses in Japanese defenses, often arriving at dawn or dusk, when visibility was poor, was challenging, and reaction time was limited. Pilots would fly low to avoid radar detection, then climb rapidly to strike their targets before descending to escape. This combination of planning, speed, and innovation left Japanese pilots scrambling, often reacting rather than initiating action. The Mustangs became symbols of inevitability, a demonstration that the United States could reach Japan at will. Historical accounts from Japanese pilots describe the disbelief and fear these missions inspired. Many noted the speed and precision of the Mustangs, the audacity of their attacks, and the difficulty in mounting a successful defense. For some, it was the first time they realized that technological superiority could decisively change the course of an engagement. For others, it was a moment of humiliation, a stark reminder that Japan's air power was no longer dominant in its own skies. The combination of surprise, speed, and extended reach created a psychological advantage as powerful as any weapon. By the end of these initial missions, it was clear that the appearance of Mustangs over Tokyo was not a fluke or isolated incident. The Americans had demonstrated a new kind of air power, one that combined innovation, planning, and relentless execution. The Japanese had been caught off guard, and the consequences were far-reaching. The shock to pilots and commanders alike reshaped Japanese strategy and forced them to reconsider their assumptions about homeland defense. In conclusion, the story of the P-51 Mustang and its drop tanks is a story of surprise, innovation, and the human response to the unexpected. For Japanese pilots, seeing these planes streaking over Tokyo at 444 miles per hour was more than a tactical challenge. It was a psychological blow, a moment that forever changed their perception of the war. The hook is clear. Speed, technology, and audacity combined to catch Japan off guard, proving that sometimes in war, the most powerful weapon is the element of surprise. The skies over Tokyo would never be the same again, and the lessons learned in those fleeting moments would resonate throughout the rest of the Pacific conflict. The story of the P-51 Mustang begins long before it ever appeared over Tokyo. It was born out of necessity, ambition, and the urgent demands of a world at war. In the early years of World War II, Allied forces recognized the need for a long-range fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. European theaters demanded aircraft that could cover hundreds of miles, protect bombers from enemy fighters, and maintain speed and maneuverability. The Mustang, developed initially in the United States and refined with the legendary British-designed Merlin engine, became the answer to that need. At first glance, the P-51 might seem like just another fighter, but it was far more than that. Every detail of its design spoke of innovation. Its streamlined fuselage reduced drag, allowing for higher speeds and better fuel efficiency. The wing design provided remarkable lift and agility, making it deadly in dogfights. The combination of a lightweight frame with a powerful Merlin engine meant the Mustang could reach speeds approaching 444 miles per hour, faster than most Japanese fighters could even dream of achieving. But speed alone was not enough to make it revolutionary. The real game changer came in the form of drop tanks. Drop tanks were, in essence, additional fuel containers that could be attached to the wings of a plane. They allowed aircraft to fly much longer distances than their internal fuel capacity would normally allow. Once the fuel was used, the tanks could be jettisoned, dramatically reducing weight and increasing maneuverability. This innovation was simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. Suddenly, American pilots could launch missions that would have been impossible just a year or two earlier. They could strike targets hundreds of miles inside enemy territory and return safely, all while carrying the same firepower as their normal missions. For Japanese pilots, the concept of a long-range fighter armed with drop tanks was entirely unexpected. Japan's defensive strategy was built around the assumption that enemy aircraft could only reach the home islands from nearby bases. Radar and early warning systems were positioned accordingly, and pilots were trained to intercept threats approaching from relatively short distances. The idea that a fighter could arrive over Tokyo from hundreds of miles away, strike targets, and disappear almost immediately completely undermined these assumptions. The drop tanks turned the Mustang into a symbol of American reach and ingenuity, a plane that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. The first missions over Japan were carefully planned. American strategists understood that long-range attacks required meticulous preparation. Bases were chosen that allowed Mustangs to take off with full drop tanks, fly undetected across the ocean, and reach targets before Japanese defenses could react. Pilots were trained to fly low over radar coverage, only climbing when necessary to engage their objectives. Timing was critical. Dawn and dusk provided natural cover, shadows, and reduced visibility, making it even harder for Japanese defenses to track the aircraft. Each mission was designed to exploit every weakness in Japan's air defense network, combining speed, surprise, and the unprecedented range provided by drop tanks. On arrival over Tokyo, the Mustangs were a sight few Japanese pilots could comprehend. Their sleek design, high speed, and tactical precision made them difficult to intercept. For those on the ground, they were equally baffling. Anti-aircraft artillery struggled to track them, and command centers scrambled to understand the threat. Reports from Japanese pilots describe moments of confusion, with some initially thinking the planes were experimental prototypes or misjudging the number of attackers. The presence of drop tanks, a feature entirely unfamiliar to Japanese forces, only added to the mystery. These tanks allowed the Mustangs to strike far and fast, then drop the extra fuel and fight at peak efficiency. It was a blend of technology and tactics that left the enemy disoriented and reactive. The tactical advantage of the Mustang with drop tanks was immense. Not only could they escort bombers over vast distances, but they could also perform independent strikes deep in enemy territory. This forced Japanese commanders to reconsider their strategies, spreading their forces thin and trying to predict where the next attack might come from. In essence, the Americans had turned the air over Japan into a dynamic battlefield where they controlled the tempo and direction of engagements. Japanese pilots were constantly reacting, rarely able to take the initiative. But it wasn't just about hitting targets. The psychological impact of these missions was profound. Japanese pilots were trained to defend their homeland, to anticipate enemy approaches, and to engage in dogfights on their terms. The sudden appearance of Mustangs at incredible speeds shattered these expectations. Each mission reinforced the notion that Japanese air defenses were no longer sufficient, that the enemy could reach any part of the home islands with impunity. Morale began to erode, both in the Air Force and among civilian populations aware of these unprecedented raids. American pilots, on the other hand, were fully aware of the advantage drop tanks gave them. They trained rigorously to make the most of every mission. Drop tanks meant they could fly longer distances without stopping, allowing for strategic flexibility. They could escort B-29 bombers, attack targets independently, or strike multiple objectives in a single sortie. Once the tanks were dropped, the Mustangs became lighter, faster, and more maneuverable, capable of outmatching Japanese fighters in dogfights. The combination of preparation, technology, and execution turned the Mustang into a formidable weapon of war. The first encounters over Tokyo were a learning experience for both sides. American pilots tested tactics, refined approaches, and observed Japanese responses. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, struggled to comprehend how a single plane could strike so far from its base with such speed and precision. Each engagement highlighted the limitations of Japan's defensive planning and the effectiveness of the Mustang drop tank combination. Over time, Japanese commanders realized that their assumptions about the range, speed, and operational flexibility of Allied aircraft were outdated. The use of drop tanks also exemplified a broader theme of innovation during World War II. Both the design of the P-51 and the strategic use of drop tanks reflected the United States' ability to combine industrial capability with tactical ingenuity. These missions were not just demonstrations of technological superiority. They were carefully orchestrated operations that exploited enemy weaknesses, maximized the strengths of American pilots, and changed the rules of air combat in the Pacific. By the time the first series of Mustang raids concluded, it was clear that Japan faced a new kind of threat. No longer were attacks predictable, limited, or easy to intercept. The combination of speed, range, and tactical surprise made the Mustang a symbol of American dominance in the air. Japanese pilots and commanders had to rethink their strategies, adapt to the new reality, and face the unsettling truth that their skies were no longer their own. The impact of these missions went beyond individual engagements. Strategically, the Mustang and its drop tanks allowed the Allies to gain air superiority, support bombing campaigns, and conduct reconnaissance over areas that were previously unreachable. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots and civilians alike reinforced the idea that the United States had the capability to strike at will, fundamentally altering the course of the air war over Japan. In essence, the P-51 Mustang with drop tanks was more than a plane. It was a revolution in air warfare, a combination of speed, technology, and strategy that left Japan scrambling to defend its homeland. Every mission over Tokyo demonstrated the effectiveness of preparation, innovation, and daring execution. The Mustang became a symbol not just of American ingenuity, but of the shifting balance of power in the Pacific. Japanese pilots would never look at the skies the same way again, and the lessons learned from these raids would echo throughout the remainder of the war. The story of the Mustang and its drop tanks is a testament to the power of innovation and the importance of thinking beyond conventional limits. It shows how a simple idea executed perfectly can change the course of a conflict. For Japanese pilots and commanders, the appearance of these long-range, high-speed fighters over Tokyo was both a shock and a warning. The era of predictable air combat was over, replaced by a new reality where speed, range, and surprise dictated the outcome. In conclusion, the rise of the P-51 Mustang and the introduction of drop tanks revolutionized the Pacific Air War. These innovations allowed the Allies to strike deep into Japanese territory, challenging assumptions, testing defenses, and reshaping strategy. For Japanese pilots, the arrival of Mustangs over Tokyo was more than a tactical surprise. It was a revelation of what the enemy was capable of, and a clear signal that the war in the air had entered a new, unpredictable phase. By the time the first P-51 Mustangs appeared over Tokyo, the Japanese Air Force was unprepared for what they were about to face. Japan's pilots, many of whom had years of experience in the Pacific theater, were trained to defend against conventional attacks, usually from nearby islands or slower bombers. They had developed tactics, strategies, and a sense of confidence in their ability to control the skies over their homeland. But the arrival of the Mustangs shattered that confidence almost instantly. The first reaction among Japanese pilots was disbelief. Reports describe moments of hesitation as pilots tried to identify what they were seeing. These planes moved at speeds far greater than anything they had previously encountered. From a distance, their sleek design and incredible velocity made them almost seem like ghosts or experimental aircraft. Some pilots initially underestimated the number of planes involved, thinking only a few had penetrated Japanese airspace. In reality, these were well-coordinated attacks involving multiple Mustangs and long-range bombers, all synchronized with precision. Japanese radar operators were equally shocked. Radar systems had been positioned to detect conventional aircraft approaching from expected directions and distances. The Mustangs, using low-altitude approaches and timing their missions for dawn or dusk, were able to slip past many of these early warning systems. When the planes were finally detected, it was often too late for effective interception. The speed of the Mustangs made it extremely difficult for Japanese pilots to gain an advantage in dogfights. Anti-aircraft guns, though plentiful, struggled to track such fast-moving targets, and by the time they could fire, many Mustangs had already passed or maneuvered out of range. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots cannot be overstated. Imagine facing an enemy that seems to arrive from nowhere, strikes with deadly precision, and leaves without warning. Every encounter with a Mustang was a reminder that the air over Japan was no longer secure. Pilots who had grown confident in their abilities now felt vulnerable. Morale began to erode as experienced pilots realized that no matter how skilled they were, the combination of American technology, speed, and tactical planning gave the enemy a clear advantage. One of the most astonishing aspects of the Mustang raids was the use of drop tanks. Japanese pilots had never encountered aircraft capable of flying such long distances without stopping. The drop tanks allowed Mustangs to escort bombers over hundreds of miles of ocean, strike Tokyo, and return safely. This capability forced Japanese commanders to rethink defensive strategy entirely. They could no longer rely on predictable attack patterns or assume that threats would be limited to nearby areas. The drop tanks turned every Mustang sortie into a strategic surprise, giving the Americans the freedom to strike where and when they chose. Accounts from Japanese pilots reveal the frustration and confusion these missions caused. Many struggled to engage the Mustangs effectively, often arriving too late or finding themselves outmaneuvered. Even experienced pilots who had fought in other theaters were caught off guard by the speed, range, and tactics of the Mustangs. The combination of surprise, extended reach, and superior performance created an overwhelming challenge. Pilots often reported that by the time they identified the aircraft and prepared to engage, the Mustangs had already accomplished their mission and were retreating safely. The impact of these raids went beyond individual dogfights. Ground crews, anti-aircraft units, and command centers were all affected by the sudden appearance of these long-range fighters. Japanese strategy, which had been based on predictable enemy movements and limited-range attacks, had to be abandoned or drastically modified. Resources were diverted and defenses were stretched thin in an attempt to respond to an unpredictable enemy. The Mustangs, with their speed and reach, forced Japanese forces to operate reactively rather than proactively, which was a significant disadvantage in any military campaign. Psychologically, the raids had a demoralizing effect on both pilots and civilians. Pilots felt the constant pressure of facing an enemy capable of reaching their home territory at will. Civilians, hearing reports of air raids and witnessing the speed and precision of the attacks, began to question the effectiveness of their defenses. The sense of safety that had once existed in Tokyo and other major cities was gone. The skies were no longer predictable or secure, and the realization that the enemy could strike with such freedom created widespread anxiety and fear. The Japanese high command struggled to adapt to this new reality. Traditional defensive strategies were insufficient against aircraft with extended range and unmatched speed. Efforts to improve radar coverage, scramble fighter units faster, and anticipate Mustang attack patterns were only partially successful. The Americans had set the terms of engagement, and Japan was forced to respond on their terms, often with limited success. Every successful Mustang mission reinforced the perception of American superiority in the air. Interestingly, some Japanese pilots attempted to develop counter-strategies. They tried anticipating flight paths, creating layered defense systems, and coordinating multiple interceptors to catch Mustangs in mid-flight. However, the combination of speed, tactical planning, and drop tanks consistently gave American pilots an edge. By the time Japanese forces adapted to one tactic, the Americans had already modified their approach, keeping the Japanese perpetually off balance. The Mustangs became a symbol of unpredictability, a reminder that the enemy controlled the tempo of combat. These raids also highlighted the difference in industrial capacity between the two nations. While Japan had skilled pilots and well-trained air crews, they lacked the production capability to match the quantity and quality of American aircraft. The Mustangs represented not only superior engineering, but also the ability to field large numbers of these planes over extended periods. Japanese pilots faced an enemy whose technological and industrial advantages were becoming increasingly evident with every sortie. Beyond the immediate tactical and psychological effects, The Mustang raids had strategic consequences. The extended range and superior speed then allowed the Americans to gather intelligence, strike critical infrastructure, and weaken Japanese morale without committing massive numbers of bombers. The Japanese realized that defending their homeland and required a level of coordination and resources that were increasingly difficult to sustain. The Mustangs had changed the very nature of the air war over Japan, forcing adaptations that were often reactive and insufficient. For Japanese pilots, the raids were a harsh lesson in the evolving nature of aerial warfare. Experience, skill, and traditional tactics were no longer enough. The appearance of Mustangs over Tokyo demonstrated the importance of innovation, planning, and the integration of technology into strategic operations. Japanese pilots faced an enemy who combined these elements effectively, leaving them struggling to respond. The initial shock gradually turned into respect, and for some, admiration of the Americans' audacity and capability, but it was respect born from being outmatched. Every mission flown by the Mustangs over Tokyo reinforced these lessons. Pilots learned to expect the unexpected, defenses were reevaluated, and strategies were revised. But the fundamental problem remained. The Americans had created a new paradigm in air warfare, one where speed, range, and surprise dictated the outcome. Japanese pilots and commanders alike had to accept that their previous assumptions about homeland defense were no longer valid. The human element of these encounters is also significant. Japanese pilots experienced fear, frustration, and a sense of vulnerability previously unknown in their careers. Even the most skilled pilots could find themselves outpaced, outmaneuvered, and outthought by American forces. This psychological impact was as important as any tactical victory. The sudden appearance of Mustangs over Tokyo created a sense of unpredictability and danger that lingered long after individual missions ended. In conclusion, the Japanese perspective on Mustang raids over Tokyo reveals the full extent of the shock and disruption caused by these missions. Pilots, radar operators, and commanders faced a combination of speed, range, and tactical ingenuity that completely undermined their confidence in defensive preparations. The arrival of P-51 Mustangs, aided by drop tanks, was more than just a tactical challenge. It was a psychological and strategic blow. It forced Japan to confront the limits of its air defense capabilities and adapt to a rapidly changing battlefield. The story of these raids is not only about the aircraft themselves, but about the human response to innovation and surprise. Japanese pilots, despite their training and experience, were unprepared for the combination of technology, planning, and audacity displayed by the Americans. Each mission was a lesson in the importance of adaptation, the dangers of underestimating an opponent, and the transformative power of innovation in warfare. By the time the Mustangs became a regular presence over Tokyo, Japanese pilots had learned, often painfully, that the skies they once dominated were now a contested space where speed, surprise, and technological superiority ruled. The P-51 Mustang raids over Tokyo left a legacy that went far beyond individual missions or tactical victories. They changed the very nature of air combat in the Pacific, forced Japan to reconsider its defensive strategies, and demonstrated the power of innovation and preparation in warfare. For the United States, the combination of the Mustang and drop tanks represented the culmination of engineering excellence, strategic thinking, and daring execution. A combination that could alter the course of the war with each mission flown. After the initial shock of seeing Mustangs streak across Tokyo, Japanese pilots and commanders gradually began to understand the broader implications of these raids. It was no longer just a matter of defending against surprise attacks. It was about adapting to an enemy that had redefined the rules of aerial warfare. The speed, range, and tactical flexibility of the Mustangs meant that Japan could no longer rely on its traditional air defense strategies. Radar coverage, interceptor squadrons, and anti-aircraft artillery, while still valuable, had to be reevaluated in light of a threat that could appear anywhere, strike with precision, and vanish before a counterattack could be organized. The Americans, on the other hand, had proven the effectiveness of combining technological innovation with careful planning. The drop tanks allowed the Mustangs to escort bombers, conduct independent strikes, and perform reconnaissance missions far beyond previous limits. This capability not only enhanced the operational reach of American forces, but also gave them a psychological edge. Japanese pilots and civilians alike were forced to confront the reality that the United States could strike deep within their homeland at will. The Mustangs became symbols of American air supremacy, demonstrating that speed, range, and strategic ingenuity could overcome even well-prepared defenses. The raids also had a lasting impact on Japanese morale. While pilots initially experienced shock and disbelief, over time, they began to see the raids as a demonstration of American technological and tactical superiority. Even highly experienced Japanese aviators were humbled by the Mustangs' capabilities. For civilians, the sudden strikes over major cities like Tokyo brought the war closer to home in a way that previous attacks had not. The perception of vulnerability undermined confidence in Japan's military leadership and highlighted the growing disparity between American and Japanese industrial and technological power. Strategically, the Mustang raids influenced the planning and execution of subsequent air campaigns. The United States learned valuable lessons about long-range fighter operations, coordination with bombers, and the effective use of drop tanks to extend operational reach. These lessons were applied to other theaters of the war, enhancing the effectiveness of Allied air operations across the Pacific. The ability to strike deep into enemy territory without exposing aircraft to undue risk became a cornerstone of American air strategy, allowing for sustained pressure on Japanese industry, infrastructure, and military installations. One of the most important legacies of the Mustang raids was the demonstration of how innovation could redefine the battlefield. Drop tanks, while simple in concept, allowed for operational flexibility that Japan had not anticipated. The combination of speed, maneuverability, and extended range made the Mustang not just a fighter, but a versatile tool for achieving strategic objectives. American planners understood that technological superiority alone was not enough. It had to be coupled with careful planning, skilled pilots, and bold execution. The success of these raids underscored the importance of integrating innovation into strategy, a lesson that resonates in military history to this day. The Mustang raids also forced Japanese commanders to reconsider their allocation of resources. Defending the homeland became increasingly complex as the Americans demonstrated the ability to strike from unexpected directions. Japanese pilots had to be stationed farther from the front lines, radar systems had to be upgraded, and anti-aircraft positions had to be rethought. Despite these adjustments, the inherent advantage of American technology and planning remained. The psychological pressure of knowing that the enemy could appear almost anywhere at any time had a profound effect on operational effectiveness. From a tactical standpoint, the Mustang raids revealed the limitations of traditional defensive thinking. Japanese air strategy had long relied on anticipating enemy movements and concentrating forces to intercept threats in predictable locations. The Americans, by contrast, used speed, range, and surprise to dictate the terms of engagement. Drop tanks allowed fighters to bypass conventional defenses, strike targets with precision, and retreat before a meaningful counterattack could be mounted. This shift in the dynamics of aerial combat forced Japan to operate reactively, a disadvantage that persisted throughout the remainder of the war. The impact of these raids extended to the morale and training of Japanese pilots. Experienced aviators had to adapt to a new kind of warfare where traditional dogfighting skills were often insufficient. The arrival of Mustangs over Tokyo served as a constant reminder that technological and tactical innovation could rapidly alter the balance of power. Younger pilots, witnessing these operations, learned lessons in caution, adaptability, and the importance of understanding enemy capabilities. While these lessons were valuable, they came at a significant cost. The realization that Japan's Air Force was increasingly outmatched by the Allies. The psychological and strategic effects of the Mustang raids were compounded by the broader context of the war. By 1945, Japan was already under immense pressure on multiple fronts. The combination of naval defeats, loss of territory, and relentless bombing campaigns had strained both military and civilian resources. The arrival of P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo added a new layer of complexity, demonstrating that even the capital was vulnerable to precision strikes. The raids reinforced the idea that Japan was facing an opponent capable of sustained, coordinated, and technologically superior operations. an opponent that could impose its will far beyond previously assumed limits. The success of the Mustang raids also highlighted the importance of pilot training and morale. American pilots were carefully selected and rigorously trained to maximize the effectiveness of the aircraft and their missions. The ability to operate effectively over long distances, coordinate with other units, and exploit the advantages of speed and drop tanks required skill, discipline, and confidence. These factors, combined with the technological superiority of the aircraft, created a potent combination that Japanese forces struggled to counter. In terms of long-term legacy, the Mustang raids over Tokyo influenced post-war military aviation thinking. They demonstrated that range, speed, and strategic flexibility could be more decisive than sheer numbers or brute force. The use of drop tanks, in particular, became a standard practice in air operations, illustrating how relatively simple innovations could dramatically extend the operational capabilities of aircraft. The lessons learned from these missions inform the design, training, and deployment of future fighter aircraft, shaping air strategy for decades to come. The raids also contributed to the eventual outcome of the war in the Pacific. By consistently demonstrating the ability to strike deep into Japanese territory, the Allies were able to maintain pressure on both military and civilian targets. This pressure eroded Japanese capacity to resist, disrupted command and control, and forced the diversion of resources away from other critical fronts. The psychological impact of knowing that the enemy could appear almost anywhere at any time cannot be overstated. It was a form of strategic dominance that complemented the physical destruction wrought by bombers and other combat operations. For Japanese pilots, the legacy of the Mustang raids was both humbling and instructive. They faced an enemy whose combination of technology, strategy, and execution challenged everything they had learned about air combat. Each encounter reinforced the importance of adaptability, the dangers of underestimating an opponent, and the transformative power of innovation in warfare. Even after the war, veterans would reflect on these missions as examples of how daring, skill, and technological advantage could reshape the battlefield. In conclusion, the Mustang raids over Tokyo left an enduring legacy. They demonstrated the effectiveness of combining speed, range, and tactical ingenuity to achieve strategic objectives. They forced Japan to confront its limitations, adapt to a new kind of aerial threat, and recognize the evolving nature of modern warfare. For the United States, the raids validated the investment in technology, training, and careful planning, proving that innovation could decisively shape the outcome of conflict. The lessons learned from these missions extended beyond World War II, influencing air strategy, aircraft design, and the conduct of long-range operations for generations to come. Ultimately, the story of the P-51 Mustang and its drop tanks over Tokyo is a story of audacity, ingenuity, and the relentless pursuit of advantage in warfare. It shows how a combination of innovation, preparation, and daring execution can redefine the rules of engagement, leaving a lasting mark on both the tactical and strategic levels of conflict. For Japanese pilots, it was a lesson in humility and adaptation. For the Allies, it was a triumph of planning, technology, and courage. And for history, it remains a vivid example of how the skies over a city can become the proving ground for human ingenuity and the turning point in a global struggle.